we had been in our earlier class discussing about forest society and colonialism. We will continue to do so. So far, we have discussed how the scientific forestry came as an alternative, but it was not an alternative to deforestation. Then, what the people had been practicing before and how they were stopped after the coming of the colonial rule, all in India. Now, in this section, we will be discussing how new people came in the trade of forest products after the coming of the British. Also, the development in the tribal areas because of the changes brought by the British, how the people resisted these changes. Then also we will discuss about Java. That what we saw, that there had been now new people in the trade of forest products. That there had been a traditional community engaged in the trade of forest products. It was mostly for domestic use because people outside the forest, away from the forest, depended on many forest products, and there had been communities in and around the forest which traded in the forest products. Banjaras, for example, they traded hides, horns, silk cocoons, ivory, bamboo, spices, grasses, gums and resins. Korava, Karacha, Yarakula in Madras Presidency were also communities which traditionally traded forest products. Now, after the coming of these restrictions, imposition of these restrictions, then these communities were not allowed, and in place new traders replaced them. They came. Why did the new traders came? Because they knew the forest rules. They also knew how to alter the forest rules, how to manipulate the forest rules, and their main purpose of coming to the trade of forest product was to make large profits. What would happen to the people who had earlier been engaged after losing their traditional rights over the forests? You see the Santals and Orans from Jharkhand. They were recruited in the Assam tea plantations at a very meager wage. Tea garden laborers, you might have heard of, and then most of them have been from the Jharkhand, and the Santals and Orans who earlier had been engaged, who had earlier been living near the forest or in the forest in Jharkhand, because they lost their job after the coming of the new rules and regulations, and they were forced to shift to Assam tea plantations. Then the communities which were replaced, which were thrown out of the forest, which were restricted from entering into the forest, these communities suffered largely and in a great way, and they reacted because of the changes. They reacted in many ways and in many places. Some of the reactions which we know as rebellions or revolts could be seen in the revolt of Sidhu Kanu. Sidhu and Kanu, they were two brothers. There were two other brothers also. In the Santhal Pargana, four brothers together had led the Santhal Pargana revolt. Then Birsa Munda in Chotnagpur, Aluri Sitarama Raju in Andhra Pradesh. Also in Odisha, the Khans of Ghumsar in South Odisha had rebelled in 1830s and 1840s. In all early revolts in the 19th century and early 20th century tribal revolts, you will find that the new forest rules were the basic reason, the main reason. In our, say, unit, the tribal revolt of Bastar in central provinces is taken as a case study. What was this Bastar revolt? Where is Bastar? That Bastar is located in present Chhattisgarh. The communities which live in Bastar are Maurya, Muria Gonds, Dhruvas, Bhatras and Halvas. 5 major communities: Maurya, Muria Gonds, Dhruvas, Bhatras and Halvas. And they speak different languages. They don't speak one language, a single language. They speak different languages, but share common customs and beliefs. What is their belief? They believe the earth has given them the land. No human being has given. It is the earth, goddess earth, which has given them the land. And in return they must pay something. And what do they pay? They offer something to the earth at each agricultural festival. That is the, say, payment they make. All these communities which I mentioned just now, they settle their inter-community disputes. Even, say, you see, within the village there are disputes, between the villages there are disputes, between the communities there are disputes. These communities are disputes are settled when village headmen sit together in a, say, in a meeting and discuss issues including the forest. They paid Devsari, Dand and Man for using other forest products. What does it mean? That village A wants some products, forest products from village B. And for this, village A has to pay Devsari or Dand or Man to village B. Similarly, village B would not pay in cash for taking something from village C or village D. They would pay this, say, Devsari, Dand or Man. In 1905, the British colonial government proposed to reserve 2/3 of the forest in Bastar. I earlier mentioned about the reserve forest. So 2/3 of the Bastar forest would be, say, declared reserve forest. What does it mean? That people would be, say, restricted from moving into the village, forest. They would not take any products from the forest. This means no shifting cultivation, no hunting and no collection of forest products by the local people in the reserved forest. Further, the people in the forest villages located in the reserved forest would work free for the forest department and would protect the forest from fire. What other restrictions they had in a reserve forest? That the local people would not be allowed to go into the forest for their domestic use, and they were also expected to protect the forest from fire. People of other or non-forest villages, say, there were reserved forest, and within that there were forest villages, and outside the reserve forest there were other villages, and these people from other villages were displaced without notice or compensation. Suddenly they would be displaced, they will be asked to move from that village. Then there were, say, land rents which had increased, and it was not in 1900 or 1905. Since the coming of the British, earlier the local people did not pay or paid very minimum. Now it had been increasing. Then the demand for labor had also increased in 1819 and 1900, and again in 1907 and 1908 there were famines, frequent famines. And why famines? Because people have lost their, say, resources. They do not have the capacity to withstand a, say, situation like drought. And in drought situations earlier they used to manage, but now after the say new situation, in the sense they when they do not have any resources at home, they could not withstand such pressures, and these were say causing people's worries continuously. In 1910, the revolt began in Bastar. When the Dhruvas initiated it, they circulated mango boughs. Mango boughs means say aam ki dali. In Hindi you can say. A lump of earth, mitti ka ek tukda, then chilies and arrows between the villages. So all villages were sent the message to join the revolt. They were invited to join the revolt. It is high time and we must revolt against the changes brought by the British. Bazaars were, and what did they do during the revolt? Bazaars were looted. Houses of officials and traders, they were also looted. Schools and police stations were burned and robbed. And these loots were shared by the tribals, the people who had been involved. They shared these loots. All these were symbols of colonialism to them. They were destroying colonialism. And what they saw in the form of colonialism? That these bazaars, new bazaars and houses, big houses, or of the officials and traders, school buildings, police stations, that they thought must be burnt so that this say symbol of colonialism would be wiped out. Gundadhur was their leader who could never be captured. It shows his large support base. A tribal leader who could not be captured, that means he had a large support base. People had sympathy, people had not been passing information about him to the police, because of which he could not be arrested or could not be captured by the say British police. Despite the say widespread revolt, the British were able to suppress it. They sent troops to suppress the revolt, and it took 3 months in early 1910 to gain control over Bastar. The tribal gatherings were fired upon, tribals were flogged, forcing them to flee into the jungles. Lot of say oppression took place so that the British could gain control over Bastar. This was a say tribal revolt which had been largely due to the new changes which the British had brought in the forest. However, the British were compelled to suspend the work of reservation. What reservation? Reservation of the forest, and finally reduce the area to be reserved to half. This was a major victory for the tribals. Their revolt did not go waste. What does it mean? That the people had revolted, they had also been suppressed, but the government was forced to rethink about the project. The project to declare almost a major part of Bastar into a reserve forest. Now that say plan was altered, which means it was a major victory for the tribals. Though they had been suppressed, though many of them had been flogged, many of them had been killed, the revolt did not go west. Now, so we will go to Java. How forest transformation took place in Java. Java Island in Indonesia today is famous for producing rice, but it was full of dense forests till the 19th century. It got transformed from forest to rice fields under the Dutch colonial rule of Holland. The Dutch started forest management there, for they wanted timber from Java to build ships. Same thing, what the British had been doing in India, the Dutch had been doing it in Java. There were many other similarities between the British in India and the Dutch in Java. Many communities lived in the mountains and practiced shifting cultivation in Java, as in India. The colonial government saw the shifting cultivators as marauders or villains, though they were the true protectors of forests traditionally. The villagers in India also, the tribals were seen as the villains, as if they were responsible for the deforestation. They were responsible for the wiping out of the forest. In reality, it was not so. So, in Java also, the local people, the villagers, the traditional villagers were seen as villains, but in reality, they were the true protectors of the forest. This is the map of Java in Indonesia, which had been under Dutch colonialism. There was a community in Java called Kalangs. Who were the Kalangs? Kalangs were skilled forest cutters and shifting cultivators. They were good in shifting cultivation. They were also very good in, say, the collection of forest products, trees. They were also very good in the nurturing of the trees in the forest. They were so valuable as harvesters and cutters of teak that when Java kingdom was split in 1755, they were equally divided between the two kingdoms. There was a split. Java kingdom was, say, divided between into two parts, and the Kalangs were considered so valuable that the Kalangs families were equally divided in 1755 because the Java forest largely depended on, or the nurturing of the Java forest, the sustenance of the Java forest depended on the Kalangs, Kalangs. However, the Dutch compelled the Kalangs to work under them, which the latter resisted by attacking on a Dutch fort. Their uprising was suppressed, as in Bastar, as the Kons in Odisha, or Birsa Munda in Chotnagpur. Similarly, the Kalangs had also resisted when they were compelled by the Dutch to work under them. They were forced to work under them. Their uprising was obviously because the Dutch had a superior quality military equipments. The Kalangs were suppressed, but that no way underestimates their desire to resist the change which the Dutch had been bringing in the Java forest. Then, as in India, in Java also scientific forestry was brought. In the 19th century, there began scientific forestry. Earlier we have discussed about scientific forestry, which means nothing but, say, plantation, and which, say, desired to replace forestry, natural forestry, which is not scientific, as I have mentioned earlier. By enacting forest laws, the scientific forestry was brought, and this restricted the villagers' access to forest. Villagers were punished for grazing cattle or for transporting wood without a permit or for travelling on forest roads. Plantation began in big scale by the Dutch in Java. Natural forests were cut and plantation began. The Dutch, and that is what they explained as scientific forestry. The Dutch wanted quality timber for shipbuilding as well as for railway sleepers. We have seen earlier how the British Navy and the demand for railways making sleepers that had led to deforestation in India. Similar was the case in Java. In 1882, nearly 280,000 sleepers were exported from Java alone. earlier I had mentioned that maximum 3 to 5 sleepers could be made from one tree. So you can calculate how many trees might have been cut, how much forest might have been destroyed for, say, making sleepers. The villagers were used as laborers for cutting these trees, for transporting these trees, and also making sleepers from the trees. The villagers were asked to pay high rent for the land they had been cultivating. Then they were exempted from rent if they worked as laborers. Now, this new policy was used in Java, that the land which the villagers had been using for cultivation purpose, they paid no rent. Now rent had to be paid, and if they wanted exemption from rent, they had to work as laborers without any wage. They had to pay this labor rent. Say in India also we had similar systems, say implemented by the Rajas and the princes and zamindars. The British had also brought it, called Beti and Begari, means labor rent, when the the tribals worked without paying any, without getting any wage. In Java it was called Blendog Didenstein, Blandongdienstein. Maybe I am mispronouncing it, but you can see it, the spelling. When the villagers registered, because it's a word from the Javanese language, when the villagers registered, small wages were paid, but their right to cultivate forest land remained restricted. That continued to be their Uri. There had been many similarities between the British rule in India and the Dutch rule in Java. And in the context of this deforestation and their approach to the forest rules, I mentioned that in India the British had brought the scientific forestry, and in Java the Dutch had brought the scientific forestry. And for making sleepers, they had, say, almost deforested a large tract by taking 280,000 sleepers. Scientific forestry is not natural forestry. It is, say, questioned by the ecologists today. It is only plantation, and plantation is no natural forestry. In Java, I had mentioned about the Kalang's resistance to the Dutch rule when they were compelled to work as laborers. There was another such, say, resistance by a person called Samin. Around 1890, one Surantiko Samin from a teak forest village questioned the new forest laws. He argued, since the state had not created earth, wind, water and wood, it could not own them. The state had no rights over these, say, things like earth, wind. People have their inalienable rights and they could use it. And when there was tax on that, when they had to pay rent, they must resist. And the movement which Samin had started spread very widely. By 1907, about 3,000 families followed him. They refused to pay taxes or to work as laborers under the Dutch. They were also suppressed. During the World War, Second World War, in 1942, that the Dutch destroyed sawmills, burned the logs of teak log, so that the Japanese did not use them. That they were scared of the Japanese invasion, and that was, say, true also. In early 1942, the Japanese occupied it, Java. Before the Japanese occupied, the Dutch destroyed the sawmills, the logs of teak logs, so that the Japanese did not use them. you can see this how they were destroyed. This is called scorched earth policy. Scorched earth policy, when the Dutch destroyed the sawmills and the teak logs so that the enemies did not use them once Java was occupied. The Japanese came in March 1942, they occupied, and after their occupation, after they occupied Java, they exploited the forest recklessly because they knew that it was not theirs. That they recklessly exploited the forest. The villagers used the deforested land for cultivation. Then after the forest was destroyed, then the villagers extended cultivation to the forest. And after the war, when everything became normal, even then the forest which was lost during the war, first by the policy called scorched earth policy by the Dutch, and secondly by the Japanese, when they destroyed it deliberately, used recklessly, exploited recklessly, that could not be brought back, that could not be replaced. New developments in forestry. Since 1980s, this is recent developments, that government in Asia and Africa have realized, now we have independence, almost all countries have been free from the colonial regimes, and there has been a realization that the policy of scientific forestry has kept the forest communities away from forest and has resulted in many conflicts. It has not saved the forest, and it has also isolated the communities which live near the forest. It has unnecessarily suspected the villagers, the people who live near the forest as the villains, but they were not villains. So this is a new idea which the governments have been having, and accordingly new policy is being planned. That conservation of forest rather than collecting timber has to be the main goal. It is not collection of timber, but forest has to be conserved, and only then the balance would be maintained and the society or the whole earth would be saved from many problems. As a result, the people living near the forest are involved in the protection and preservation of forest. Conservation of forest is the responsibility of the people who live around the forest, live in and around the forest, and this need not be suspected, rather they should be given the responsibility to protect it. In some villages they have been patrolling their own forest. This is a new form of forest management and scientific in true sense of the term. This we have discussed in great details how the coming of the colonial rule has devastated the forest, has brought new changes in the forest, and irrespective of the governments, whether it was British or Dutch, every colony suffered due to these colonial interventions. Java suffered, India also suffered, the natural forests were cut, deforestation continued in large scale. To manage the deforestation, to check the deforestation, the colonial regime brought the scientific forestry, but that is not an alternative. Finally, after independence in 1970s, 80s, mostly in 1980s, the government have been realized, the independent government have been realized that the people who had earlier been conserving the forest, had been protecting the forest, must be given the responsibility, and the result is seen in the form of the people's patrol of the local forest. This is what we discussed, that in this forest society and colonialism, which is part of our class 9th history textbook. Thank you.